Okay, tonight we're going to be continuing with our study. We started last week a new study. Before that, we were doing Wisdom for Dummies, which was a study in Proverbs. And we kind of set that aside for a little while. And we're doing a study in Paul's letter to the church at Rome, the book of Romans. I just felt it was a good way to start out the new year with a doctrinal study. The book of Romans is one of the most doctrinally, it's one of the fullest, most complete letters of all of Paul's writings. He covers a lot of different topics. If you remember, just a little refresher, I said basically it's divided into 3 parts. The first 8 chapters are doctrinal in nature, where Paul tells us what it means to be saved. You know, isn't that something? I mean, I guess that's something we all ought to know. You know, as Christians, what does it mean if you say I'm saved and somebody says saved from what? And we ought to know what salvation is about. You remember I had said that Paul wrote this letter. He had never been to Rome at the writing of this letter. He eventually got an all-expense-paid trip on a prison ship to Rome later on in his life. But he wrote this letter to make sure the Romans knew. He wanted to make sure they were grounded and rooted in the truth. So the first 8 chapters are doctrinal. Then chapters 9 through 11 are dispensational because they talk about Israel and our relationship to the nation of Israel. You know, from the time of about 70 A.D., the temple was destroyed by the Roman general Titus, and then about 50 or 60 years later, somebody had a revolt against the Romans, and they kicked the Jews out of Jerusalem and the land completely. And from that time until 1948, there was no Israel, but we all know what happened after the Holocaust when Israel was reborn. So Paul deals with that because a lot of people think that God's done with Israel and he no longer has anything to do with that nation. But we're going to read when we get there, which will probably be a little while, that God has not forsaken the nation Israel. And finally, the last few chapters of Romans deal with how we're supposed to live as saved people in an unsaved society. How many people know our society is not saved? And how do we interact? You know, it would be nice if all the Christians got together and bought an island somewhere and just went there and lived, you know, and just had their own little world. But you know, we don't have that. We can't lock ourselves into a monastery or somewhere. We have to deal with on our jobs and our neighborhoods, and we have to deal with what goes on Catalpa Street and up and down Lishman and Kenneth Avenue. So anyway, that's the book of Romans. It's really an all-encompassing book. And last week we had a little introduction. We read on chapter 1 from verse 1 through verse 14, 15, 16. We're going to start on verse 14 tonight, kind of pick up where we left off. Paul wrote this letter. He said, I'm an apostle. I'm called to be an apostle to the Gentiles, which again we said last week that for Paul to be a minister to the Gentiles was truly a work of God because he was a Pharisee before he was saved. And the Pharisees hated the Gentiles. I mean, hated them. It was they wouldn't walk on the same side of the street because they were afraid if they brushed up against them, they'd become unclean. So they hated Gentiles. When Peter was first called to the house of Cornelius, again, this is in Acts chapter 7, 8, or 9. One of those, I can't remember which chapter. Peter was the first one to preach to a Gentile. Cornelius was a Roman centurion that believed in God, and God sent Peter. And Peter told Cornelius, he said, he says, Jews just don't go into Gentile houses. But God broke that wall down. And so anyway, we had talked about that. And I want to start in verse 14 tonight, chapter 1. As Paul introduced himself, and at the beginning of his letter, he said this, I'm a debtor, both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and to the unwise. So as much as in me, I am ready to preach the gospel to you that are at Rome also. Paul said that his position as an apostle, I mentioned last week that people today that call themselves apostles, sometimes they see that as an elevated, exalted kind of position. But the apostles of the New Testament were ones that were called to go to places that nobody else would go to go to people that everybody else thought wasn't worth the time. They didn't care if they were Greeks or barbarians, intelligent or not intelligent. They didn't care if they were rich or poor. Paul says, I owe it to you as a creation of God to tell you the gospel. I owe it to you. And if that's the case with Paul, I think we all kind of fit into that category. We all owe it to our neighbors, to our loved ones, to our family members, to tell them the gospel. We can't save them. But I'll guarantee you, if they don't hear the gospel, they won't be saved. Okay, now, here we go. Verse 16. He says, for I am not ashamed of the gospel. One thing that we'll see in Romans, we'll see two sides as we read through this letter. There's wrath and there's righteousness. There's judgment and there's mercy. There's no in between. We as human beings are either going to suffer God's judgment or we're going to enjoy His mercy. We have one or two choices. You might say, well, I'd much rather have mercy than judgment, wouldn't you? How does that happen? Well, Paul goes on and he explains this. There are those, at one time, law schools would use the book of Romans to teach how to present an argument in court. Because this is what Paul does. He's going to begin by laying down some principles that, as he goes on, he's going to develop those principles into explaining the difference between judgment and mercy, the difference between God's wrath and His righteousness. Okay? A lot of people don't like to think of God as a wrathful God. But God is angry. He's a loving God. He sent His Son, that whosoever should believe in Him shall not perish. So He expresses love. But He's a wrathful God. That doesn't seem to go over well in some places. They kind of like to stay away from that because they want to present like a kind of warm, fuzzy God. And He can be that way, but there's also wrath. Listen to what he says. Verse 16. It says, make sure the volume downstairs, I put the TV on down there so they could hear. Okay. Verse 16. The Apostle Paul says this. We just dealt with this passage here a couple weeks ago, Sunday morning, and I don't want to rehash things, but yeah, I do. Yeah, okay. Verse 16. Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. For it's the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Have you ever in your life been ashamed of the gospel? Have you ever refused to say something when you should have said it? Have you ever kept your mouth shut when you knew you should have opened it? I think everybody in here at one time or another probably says, man, I wish I should have said something. I should have said something to that waitress. I should have left the trash. I should have said something to that. But there are times when either it's inconvenient or whether it's, Paul says, I'm not ashamed. He wasn't afraid to tell anybody anywhere. And he paid the price for it. He got beat up more than once. Stoned and left for dead. He said, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Why? For it's the power of God unto salvation. Nobody's going to get saved unless they hear the gospel. That's it. That's the power of God. The power of God unto salvation to everyone that believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. See, the early Christians, who were all Jews, they thought that there was still a division. They thought that for a Gentile to come into the family, into the household of faith, that they had to become a Jew. They had to be circumcised and they had to do the law, the Torah, and so forth. The first big dispute in the church, the Jerusalem Council, Acts chapter 15, they were dealing with the Gentile problem. They had a Gentile problem. What are we going to do with these? Not Denny. That's Denny's last name, but I'm not talking about. But they had the non-Jews. They were like, we got all these Gentiles coming in here, and they're not circumcised, and they eat pork, and they don't know the law of Moses, and they determined that they didn't have to. Thank God. Thank God I don't have to wear a yarmulke whenever I come to church. I don't have to wear a prayer shawl. I don't have to go through all that stuff. Because, why? Because Peter said, if you read that in Acts chapter 15, he said, listen, we couldn't do all that stuff. How do we expect them to do it? And they were raised with it from children. They had to drill into them from when they were old enough to understand. So Peter says, if it couldn't save us, do we think it's going to save them? And all they did was they gave the Gentiles some things, because there were Jews everywhere. They don't want to offend the Jewish. So they said, don't eat things strangled or things with blood and so forth. But he goes on and he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, verse 17. For therein, in the gospel, is the righteousness of God revealed. Remember, we said there's righteousness and there's wrath. We're going to see that all through this letter. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. And remember, last week I said that sentence right there was a quotation from the book of Habakkuk, the Old Testament prophet, and it's quoted a couple different times in the New Testament. And it says that's the way how are we saved? How are we supposed to live? We're supposed to live by faith. We're saved by faith. We live by faith. Faith. We believe what Jesus did on the cross was sufficient to have my sins forgiven. I don't have to work for it. I don't have to earn it. I don't have to say so many prayers. I don't have to crawl anywhere on my knees. It was done on the cross. And when I put my faith on the cross, if you remember in John chapter 3, it says, just like Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, remember that story? Where the people were being bit by serpents because they were murmuring and complaining. And God told Moses, put a brazen serpent on a pole and lift it up. And all they had to do was look at it. Now, there wasn't some kind of magic on that serpent, but it was by obedience, believing what God said. If God said, look at it, they looked at it and they lived. Look up and live. The same thing with Jesus hanging on the cross. It's not a series of things that we have to do. It's faith. We believe God, and it's counted us for righteousness. Okay. He says that's the righteousness of God revealed from faith. In verse 18, God not only reveals his righteousness, but he reveals his wrath. What Paul is doing, he's laying the groundwork for the preaching of the gospel. See, people can't understand the good news until they know the bad news. The bad news is we're all lost and dying and going to hell without Christ. That's bad news. And some folks, again, they want to kind of steer away from that because that's a little, you make people feel a little antsy. I mean, I've had times where I've preached. I remember one time I was preaching John chapter 3. You must be born again. And there were some folks out there. It was squirming, man. I mean, not that I'm such a great preacher, but it's God's word, that says you must be born again. And people was out there going, they were like this, There was a couple couples out there, and they never came back. But I mean, you can't understand. You can't understand the good news until you hear the bad news. Because if you don't hear the bad news, you're not going to understand why you need to hear the good news. So Paul says that the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness. God has shown his wrath before. Noah's flood. You remember that story in the book of Genesis? The hearts of all men were only evil continually. And what did God do? He sent a flood. He saved Noah. There were just 8 people, Noah and his family, saved in the ark. And the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, they were wicked. God sent judgment. God has wrath. Please don't kid yourself into thinking that God is not angry at the United States of America, our culture, our society, and what's happening in our society and the way people are living and what's going on. He hasn't turned a deaf ear. He hasn't closed his eye, because I know there's lots of people praying saying, Lord, what is happening? What's happened to our nation? See, we're going to find out as we read here, it's not Democrat or Republican. It's not liberal or conservative. It's wrath and righteousness. Okay? He goes on, he says, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness, against all godless, all disregard of the things of God. People don't care what God thinks. There's folks in church that don't care what God thinks. There's some preachers that don't care what God thinks. Leaders of denominations and churches. They used to care. There used to be those who would care, well, we can't do that because the Word says. But now it's like, well, yeah, that's old, the Bible, we can't. I said this, before, that just recently I went to my doctor. I had blood tests, just get a physical. And my doctor said, you're pre-diabetic. I said, okay. He said, if you don't do something, you're going to be post-diabetic. You're going to be. And I said this, there were one of three things I could have done. I could have said, man, you don't know what you're talking about, to the doctor. Or else I could have said, thanks, doc, and went home and ate half an apple pie, Or else I couldn't. And what I try to do is, go. He said, well, you got to start exercising. You got to start watching what you eat. I said, all right. So I dropped the sweets. But, whatever, it's not going away. I could pretend like it's not there. But if I do that, in 2 or 3 years, I'll be taking blood samples. And it's the same thing with this. We can pretend like, oh, well, this is an old book and it doesn't apply anymore. And God, it really isn't wrathful. And he doesn't get mad. He's God, he's love, and he doesn't get mad. And all this stuff, we're only human and we all make mistakes, blah, blah. We've all heard it before. We could pretend that, but that's not going to keep us out of hell. Because when we talk about being saved, what are we saved from? We're saved from an eternity in hell. That's number one, anyway, okay? He says that the wrath of God revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness. If you talk to people, and I've said this before, some people will say, if you say, well, what's the problem in our society? Somebody say abortion. Abortion is a terrible thing. It is. It's horrible. Some might say, oh, gay marriage. Every state's legalizing gay marriage. And, those things are... But we said this when we talked about this a few weeks ago. That's not the problem. Those aren't the problem. They're the symptoms of a problem. The economy. That's not the problem. It's a symptom of the problem. And here's the problem. Here's the problem. Because that, verse 18, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has showed it unto them. Man has ignored and turned his back on God. I want to tell you something. One of the chief, in my eyes, one of the chief seeds of the problems that we have today, back in the 1800s, a guy wrote a book called On the Origin of Species. Y'all know what I'm saying? Evolution. But that's not the whole title of the book. Origin of Species. Here's the whole title of the book, the original title. On the origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Charles Darwin was a eugenicist. He planted the seeds of eugenics. What's eugenics? That's the study of manipulating populations by trying to socially eliminate certain undesirable races. Hitler loved eugenics. That's what he tried to do in the Great Solution. When there was a time when this first came out, most scientists, if you look through history, most people who were scientists, they believed in God. They might not have been born again Christians. They might not have embraced the Trinity and the God of the Bible, but they believed in God. Albert Einstein was offended that they called him an atheist. He wasn't a Christian. He didn't believe in the personal God of the Bible, but he believed that there was a creator. But now, at one time it was illegal to teach evolution in school. Well, now it's flipped. And when they started teaching, and I've done a presentation about science, falsely so-called and all that. When they started teaching that everything just happened by accident, and they said, well, there's really no, science has proved there's no God. You can trace the demise of our society. When we stop understanding that there's a God up in heaven that said some things were right and some things were wrong, and all this, it's scientific. It's not scientific, it's foolishness. But Satan has done a good job. He's done his work well. We now live in a society where if you believe in the creation, you're considered stupid, superstitious, overly religious. They'll laugh at you. They'll pretend like science is disproving that. So what do we have now? We have a generation of kids growing up not realizing that they have a reason to live. Not realizing they're a reflection of the holy God that created them in his image. And we have a society, instead of thinking about what God wants, well, he's not there. That's make-believe. They're looking for life on Mars. They're spending billions of dollars looking for life. You know how much life they're going to find out there? Zero. Every time they spend all this money, they send a spaceship on Mars, and they dig holes, and they dig in rocks, and they design these things, spend billions of dollars. You know what they find? Nothing. Dirt and dust. Why? Because life didn't happen by accident. It was something God had done. He spoke it. He created us. And what we're reading here in Romans, it says in verse 20, for the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen. It doesn't take a genius to look at the intricacy of nature. And if anything, now that we're able to go smaller and smaller, at one time they could just see certain things with microscopes and so forth, but now they have electron microscopes. They can see the very complex things that cause life to exist. How can they say it happened by accident? All the hundreds of things that have to happen in a living cell to help it grow and help it multiply and reproduce and metabolize food. They're without excuse. If Paul was writing this in the first century, how much more? He says the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. It says in Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the earth shows forth his handiwork. Just look in the sky. That one presentation I did. You know why they came up with the Big Bang Theory? You ever hear? Some people think, it's scientific. They back in the 1920s, scientists used to think that everything just kind of always was the way it was. Well, you know what they found out? Edwin Hubble. You ever hear that name, Edwin Hubble? He was a great astronomer. They named a telescope after him, Hubble telescope. He found out scientifically by measuring and observing that the universe is expanding. Everything's moving away from each other. What a great discovery. The only problem was people they just ignored it, because that meant if everything was expanding, it must have had a beginning. There must have been one time, if everything's moving out, there must have been a time when it was all together. And according to Stephen Hawking, you know who he is, the guy in the wheelchair? He said most scientists just ignored it because they didn't want to deal with the idea that there was a beginning. They have to say, there's a creator. So somebody came up with the idea, maybe there was a big explosion. That's where it came from. According to those guys, that's what they say happened. And that's science. They say that's science. It's nonsense. God spoke everything into existence. Before he created the stars or the moon or the sun, he created light. That's what it says. Okay. It says they're without excuse. They don't have an excuse. He says in verse 21, because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God. Neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. See, they don't disbelieve in God because of science. They disbelieve in God because they don't want to have to answer. Mankind doesn't like to be told what to do. And this is the same stuff that happened all the way back in the garden. The same lie. In the garden, what did God do? He gave Adam and Eve one test of faith. One test of faith. One law they had to obey. It wasn't a hard law. Well, I wasn't there, maybe it was. But it was one law. There was one tree God said, this is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, don't eat from this tree. Everything else, they had everything, it meant they had it laid out. He said, don't eat from this tree. Why did he say, was there something special about that tree? No, it was just a tree. But why did he say that? Because he wanted them not to forget that he was God and they weren't. Okay? He said, this is my boundary right here. This one, don't eat of this tree. What did Satan tell Eve? He said, God's a liar. That's what he said. Read it, Genesis chapter 3. What are we reading right here? They're taking the truth of God and they're turning it into a lie. It says, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and they changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like the corruptible man, into birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. They dragged God down to be inferior to us. They make God a creation of ours instead of us being a creation. They flip it over. Because of that, see, this is where we're at. And this is the way it's been in every society, every major culture, every nation, every empire that has risen and fallen. Their demise begins when they reject the idea of a God that tells them what's right and what's wrong. Listen. Verse 24. Wherefore, God also gave them up. You're going to see that phrase about 3 times in these next few verses. He gave them up to uncleanness through the lusts of their own hearts. Not the lusts of their flesh. You know, the lust of the flesh, we all got to deal with that. You know, I tell folks, our enemies are like the world, the flesh, and the devil. I can shut the world out. The devil I can rebuke, but man, I'm stuck in this flesh. We're not talking about the lust of the flesh. Here he says the lust of what, not the flesh, but the lust of their hearts. See, I can love Jesus, and I got to deal. I got to bring my flesh under. How many people know what I'm talking about? Paul says, I got to die every day. I got to crucify my flesh every day. He loved Jesus. He wasn't talking about the lust of their flesh. He's talking about what they loved. What do you love? Do you love God? Sometimes as much of a failure we can be, we can still love God. But God gave them up to uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves. It wasn't the lust of the flesh now. It was what they loved. Another place Paul writes about those who did not receive the love of the truth. Do you love the truth tonight? We live in a nation where we have lost the love of the truth. When a nation or a society or a culture begins to hate the truth and love a lie, we see what we're seeing happen in our world right now. The progression that we see. They knew God. They rejected God. They did not glorify God. They were not thankful. They began to make things up in their mind to explain God away. They allowed their hearts to be darkened. They began to think highly of themselves. They created gods in their own image. God gave them up to uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies. You're going to apply this to the pre-flood days. You're going to apply this to Sodom and Gomorrah. You're going to apply it to Babylon. You're going to apply it to Rome. You're going to apply it to Nazi Germany. You can apply it to the United States of America. Who changed the truth of God into a lie. Did God really say? God's a liar. He just doesn't want you to be like him. That's what they said to Eve. That's what Satan said to Eve. Who changed the truth of God into a lie and worshiped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. For this cause, God gave them up unto vile affections. For even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. Now get this. See, Christians today, a lot of them, you say, what's the problem? They say, well, it's gay marriage and everything. That's just a symptom. Because it's the ultimate slap in God's face. When we refuse to believe that everything we see in nature was created by God, then we begin to make up our own rules. So, all of nature is like male and female. Plants, animals, male and female. Some animals have both in them, but it's still male and female. That's the way it is. That's the natural. That's the way God made it. But we have exalted ourselves to such a place that we can say, no, man, it don't apply to us. It applies to monkeys, it applies to dogs, cats, but it doesn't apply to us. Because we know better. We know better. We have a committed relationship. And I'm not down on gay people. Please don't. I don't hate gay people. I pray for them. They need saved just like we. Their sin is no worse. We're going to read here in just a minute. Their sin is no worse than all the other ones. But that is like the ultimate, that's a sign. That's like the stage 4 cancer. That's showing that a society and a culture and a civilization is on the edge of destruction. When the people begin, there's always been homosexuals. There's always been gays. But when a society begins to condone and support and allow for and even make it like a good thing, it's a sign that God has given us up. Still pray for our nation, pray for our leadership. We still pray, we don't stop praying. It says, and just like Satan started with Eve, it starts with the women, he says, for this cause God gave them up unto vile affections, for even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman. Natural, it's natural. See, what they've tried to do is they've tried to turn this into like a racial thing, like black and white, mixed marriage and stuff. But see, here's the thing. You can't make a baby with two men. You can't make a baby with two women. It takes male. That's natural. Anything that's not natural is perverse. Okay? He says, likewise also the men of verse 27, leaving the natural use of the women, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men working that which is unseemly and receiving in themselves the recompense of their error which is meet, and they give them a TV show. And even as they did not like to retain God, don't give me that God stuff. God gave them over, there it is again, to a reprobate or a disqualified mind. To do those things which are not convenient. Being filled, now, but at this time, all the Christians are saying, yeah, man, Sodom and Gomorrah, yeah, but wait a minute. Being filled with all unrighteousness, check this list out. Fornication. We don't have to explain what these words mean. I think we all kind of know what they mean. Wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness. Maliciousness, that's when you talk about people. Okay. Full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers. I say, hey, wait a minute. We were talking about them gay folks now. This is getting a little personal. Okay. Without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, that means you can't make it peaceful, unmerciful, who knowing the judgment of God, probably missed a couple in there, but that's all right. Who knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy. Man, I mean, Paul is painting this picture. He's getting ready to tell us about salvation. He's getting ready to tell us the good news because he's laying down the bad news. The people we think are the worst in society, they're just the symptom, but ultimately, all of us somewhere is going to fit if we're not saved. He's talking, we all fit in here somewhere. Somebody might say, well, I don't do that. Well, knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do they do them, but they like watching it on HBO. They have pleasure in them to do it. How many folks say, I'll never do that, but they'll go home and they flick on? Okay, now, Paul's laying this out. And by this time, I it's just my imagination, but you know, the folks in Romans, the Christians in Romans, reading this saying, yeah, Paul, yeah. Especially Jews, man, they say, yeah, man. But then he says this in chapter 2. By the way, the chapters aren't in the original. When Paul wrote this letter, he didn't write chapters and verses. It was just for our benefit. He says in chapter 2 and verse 1, I'm sorry, I don't have that up, but therefore, he says this, thou art inexcusable, O man. See, because the people who are got their hands saying up, yeah, praise the Lord. You're inexcusable, O man, whosoever thou art that judgest, for wherein you judge another, you condemn yourself. Because where it says, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever should believe in him shall not perish. And then it says, John the Baptist said, behold the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. Not sins, not your list. We're all sold under sin. Mine might not be as flagrant as somebody else's. Well, I go to church. Mine might not be open. Jesus said, you've heard it said, thou shalt not commit adultery. Well, if you lust in somebody after your heart, in your heart, nobody else might see it, but God sees it. He says, he talks about the judgment of God, and we'll pick this up next week. How does God judge? Is his judgment any worse than the guy in the crack house around the corner than it is in Allegheny Valley Church God? See, without Christ, this is what Paul's trying to establish, and we're going to see this as we get into chapter 2 and chapter 3. Without Christ, somebody's sin might be up here, and maybe your sin is like this. But without Christ, you're both going to the same hell. Without the blood of Jesus and faith in what he did on the cross. See, this is what Paul wants them to understand. You're not saved by being a Jew. You're not saved by being Pentecostal. You're not saved by talking in tongues. You're not saved by learning the Bible. You're not saved by prayer or fasting. Those things, all these things are good. None of it saves you. People can learn how to preach until the walls fall in. End up dying and going to hell. Why? Because the only hope we have is Jesus Christ. Jew, Gentile, Greek, barbarian, rich, poor. He's the only hope. And see, I pray that in myself, I see things that get me so mad. Y'all know, I know I've said this before, you watch Fox News and you see, and it makes you so mad. You see what's going on. Look what they're doing in Washington. It's the way the world goes. What do we expect? Paul lived under Nero. He was crazy. Yet Paul said, pray for those in authority. You see, when we find ourselves in Christ, then I go back to what Paul said in verse 14. We owe it to the gay, to the crack dealer, to the people shooting guns, to the drug dealers on the corner. We owe it to them to share the gospel. Because before I was saved, I never sold dope. I wasn't homosexual. I had my own set of things. But before I was saved, I was going to the same hell they're going to. And I thank God somebody saw fit to come up to me one day and say, hey, do you know where you're going when you die? And I just pushed that off. First time. I thank God for His mercy that He let it happen a couple more times until I finally said, okay. How many know what I'm talking about? Aren't you glad somebody told you about Jesus? I was no angel. Even my mom knew that. Sometimes our parents think you're a little angel. My parents knew. I thank God for His mercy. We're going to go on and read as we pick this up next week. We're going to read about God's judgment. How He judges. He doesn't judge like we judge. A lot of times we'll use ourselves as like the measuring line, Well, I'm not that bad, Somebody said when you look at somebody else, it's like looking with a microscope. If you're looking at yourself, it's like looking way far away, And we judge, we'll look at somebody else. Well, I ain't like that. I wouldn't do it. I never did that. Oh, no. And Paul says, you who judge another, you better look out. Jesus said, people will say, well, Jesus said you shouldn't judge. He didn't say that. He said, with what measure you judge, that's how you'll be judged. So God help us. God help us. Take the gospel to the lost and dying without looking at somebody and saying, they're not worth it. Anyway, anybody have any comments or questions?